Welcome back. This second video is going to cover the ligaments associated with the female reproductive system. Essentially, there are three sets of ligaments, and we're going to cover them one at a time. Let's start with the first set. There's a ligament that enters the ovary from above, almost like it's suspending the ovary in place, so it's called the suspensory ligament. Then there's the ovarian ligament, which connects the ovary to the body of the uterus. And thirdly, there's the round ligament coming off of the uterus. Now, you might have noticed that these three ligaments almost look like they could form a single continuous line, and there's a good reason for that, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But first, here's just another diagram of the same thing. So suspensory ligament going into the ovary from above, ovarian ligament connecting it to the uterus, and then round ligament coming off of the uterus. Here's just the same thing in 3D. We've got the suspensory, ovarian, and round ligaments. So why do you suppose these three ligaments look like they could form a single continuous line? Well, it turns out that in embryology, for both men and women, the gonads, so the testes and the ovaries, actually originate really high up, like underneath the ribs near where the kidneys are. And attached to them is a cord called the gubernaculum, and the gubernaculum is sensitive to testosterone. Now, men obviously have much higher levels of testosterone, so that stimulates the gubernaculum to pull the testis all the way down through the inguinal canal into the genital swellings, which turns into the scrotum. Now, women do have some androgynous hormones, just not as high as men, so the ovaries get pulled down a little bit, down to where they are in adulthood, and then the gubernaculum just stays there and becomes the suspensory, ovarian, and round ligaments. Which is why, if you keep following the round ligament, you'll see that it does indeed go through the inguinal canal and ends in the labia majora, which is the embryological equivalent of the scrotum in women. So, to summarize, I know this is like the fourth diagram I've shown of the same thing, but just really driving the message home, the suspensory ligament suspends the ovary from above. The ovarian ligament then connects it to the uterus, and the round ligament comes off the uterus through the inguinal canal and ends in the labia, and they are all remnants of the embryological gubernaculum. The only thing I'll add to that is that the suspensory ligament of the ovary carries the ovary's blood supply, which means if you have something like an ovarian torsion, which is where the ovary twists around the suspensory ligament, it could potentially cut off its own blood supply. Alright, so we're ready to move on to the second set, which is the broad ligament. I want you to imagine that you took all of these pelvic organs and just draped a sheet on top of them. That is essentially what the broad ligament does. It's a sheet that covers all of the pelvic viscera. You may have heard that the inside of the abdominal cavity is lined by a thing called the peritoneum. Well, the broad ligament is really just the continuation of the peritoneum into the pelvis. So if you ever look at this first diagram, the broad ligament is this thing they've drawn in on the left side, and in the second diagram, it's all this brown stuff covering the organs. Now, the broad ligament can be subdivided into a couple of sections. So the part that covers the ovary and anchors the ovary in place is called the mesovarium, right? It's got ovary in the name. Now, some of you might know that the surgical removal of a fallopian tube is called a salpingectomy, and inflammation of the fallopian tube is called salpingitis. So, the part of the broad ligament that attaches to the fallopian tubes is called the mesosalpinx. And lastly, the part of the broad ligament that attaches to the uterus is called the mesometrium. So you probably know words like endometrium, is the stuff inside the uterus. The myometrium refers to the muscle of the uterus, so that's where that word comes from. So here it is in summary. The broad ligament is just the continuation of the peritoneum into the pelvis, and it can be subdivided into the mesovarium, mesosalpinx, and mesometrium, which is just the parts covering the ovary, fallopian tube, and uterus respectively. Okay, moving on to the third and final set. These are called the exterperitoneal ligaments, and they serve to anchor the organs to the surrounding bones and to the other organs. There's 5 of them in total, and the names literally all make sense. So for example, the one that starts on the sacrum, wraps around the uterus and back to the sacrum is called the uterosacral. The one that sort of forms this ring around the rectum and the uterus is called the rectouterine. You know that the word transverse means across or horizontal, so the one that goes across the uterus is called the transverse, and etc. So I made this slightly simplified diagram to show you where they all are. So once again, this is the uterosacral, rectouterine, vesicouterine, pubovesical, and transverse. And that's it. That's all the ligaments of the pelvis. So I hope that makes some amount of sense. And keep an eye out for our next video, which is going to cover blood supply.